Undocumented immigrant buys a cheap trailer, then finds a buried house. Santiago thought this cheap trailer was the only way to disappear without being noticed, and no papers. No credit. Just land in the middle of nowhere in silence at night. But the first week, he noticed the ground behind the trailer sinking slowly. One morning, his shovel hit something solid. Not rock or wall. Buried deep under the dirt. There was a house no one mentioned in the listing and no address. No history. And carved into the door, barely visible, were words in Spanish meant for someone like him. Why was it hidden? And who was it hidden from? Santiago stood over the hole with the shovel still vibrating in his hands, the metal ringing faintly as if it struck a bell buried underground. The dirt around the impact point had collapsed inward, exposing a vertical surface that should not have existed beneath the trailer lot sold as empty land. He scraped away soil with his fingers, ignoring the sting beneath his nails, until shape clarified into plaster and stone pressed together with careful intention. This was not foundation or a forgotten slab, but a wall made by someone who expected it to stand for decades. The realization tightened his chest in a way that reminded him of border crossings and nights spent hiding from engines in the dark. He glanced toward the trailer, half expecting someone to be watching from its narrow windows, even though he knew no one was there. The silence around him felt newly arranged, as if the land itself were holding its breath. He told himself to stop digging, but his body did not listen. He widened the hole with methodical slowness, each scoop of earth revealing more of the buried structure and more of his own unease. The wall extended downward beyond what he could see, straight and deliberate, not the ruin of something collapsed, but the concealment of something preserved. Santiago wiped sweat from his face and tasted metal in his mouth, the flavor of old fear returning without invitation. He thought about the man who sold him the trailer, how quickly the paperwork-less transaction had been completed, how eager the seller had been to leave. At the time, Santiago had seen that eagerness as luck, a rare mercy in a life shaped by avoidance. Now it felt like abandonment, like being handed a sealed envelope without warning of what was inside. He dug until his arms ached, until the sun crept higher and exposed a hole to daylight. When the edge of a doorway appeared, framed in rotting wood, he sat back hard on the dirt. The door was set into the wall as if the earth had grown around it rather than covered it, the soil packed so tightly it felt intentional. Santiago brushed away clumps of clay until the grain of the wood emerged, darkened by moisture but unbroken by time. His heart pounded with a rhythm that felt too loud for the open land, as though someone miles away could hear it and follow the sound. He considered the possibility of calling someone, then laughed softly at the absurdity of the thought. There was no one to call, no authority he trusted, no neighbor he could ask without inviting questions he could not afford. This trailer had been his solution, a place meant to erase him, not entangle him in someone else's secret. He leaned closer, noticing scratches etched into the wood near eye level. The markings were shallow but deliberate, shaped by a hand that wanted them to last. As he cleared the final layer of dirt, the words became legible, and Santiago felt the ground tilt beneath him without actually moving. The Spanish was careful and plain, carved without ornament, as if beauty had never been the goal. He read the message once, then again, each repetition pulling a memory loose from the back of his mind. It was written for someone crossing borders in silence, for someone carrying their life in their hands and expecting nothing from the land but shelter. The familiarity of the phrasing made his throat tighten, because it sounded like something his father might have said, or a warning passed quietly between men who did not expect to survive long enough to repeat it. Santiago touched the letters, tracing them with a fingertip, feeling the grooves worn smooth by time. The air around the door felt cooler, heavier, as if the buried space were exhaling. He pulled his hand back quickly, unsettled by the intimacy of the gesture. He sat there for a long time, listening to the wind move through dry grass and wondering how many days had passed since anyone last stood where he was now. The idea that a house could exist beneath his feet without records or memory made him feel suddenly visible, as though hiding had never been as effective as he believed. Santiago had spent years convincing himself that survival meant leaving no trace. But this door suggested the opposite, that someone had once buried a life rather than abandoned it. He thought about the routes he had taken north, the shelters that vanished overnight, the men whose names he never learned but whose faces stayed with him. This place felt connected to those memories in a way he could not explain without frightening himself. He wondered if the house had been hidden to protect someone or to erase them. The question lingered, unanswered, heavy as the dirt he had just moved. When a gust of wind slammed the trailer door shut behind him, he flinched hard enough to lose his breath. The sound echoed across the empty land, sharp and final, reminding him how alone he truly was. Santiago stood and scanned the horizon, his eyes catching on fence posts and distant hills that offered no comfort. Every instinct told him to fill the hole back in, to pretend he had never found anything at all. Another part of him, quieter but more insistent, recognized the door as a kind of invitation, dangerous precisely because it felt personal. He remembered the listing's vague description, the way the land had been marketed as forgotten, as if neglect were a feature rather than a warning. Someone had paid to keep this house buried, to remove it from maps and memory, and now Santiago had undone that work with shovel and curiosity. He imagined footsteps approaching, vehicles slowing on the road, eyes measuring the distance to his trailer. Nothing happened, yet the fear did not fade. It settled into him, patient and watchful. He forced himself to breathe slowly, counting each breath the way he had learned during long nights of waiting. The door did not move, did not creak or shift, but its presence dominated the space in a way the trailer never had. Santiago felt a strange pull toward it, not hope exactly, but recognition, like meeting someone who shared a language of loss. He pressed his ear against the wood, half expecting to hear movement or voices preserved in the dark. There was only silence, deep and absolute, a silence that felt older than the land above it. His reflection stared back at him from a narrow gap, where the door met the frame, distorted and uncertain. For the first time since buying the trailer, he questioned whether disappearing had ever been possible. The land had not forgotten what it held, and now neither could he. Santiago returned to the trailer as the sun climbed higher, but the normal routines felt false and fragile. He drank water, without tasting it, and washed dirt from his hands that seemed to cling no matter how hard he scrubbed. The words on the door replayed in his mind, each letter sharp and deliberate, refusing to blur with repetition. He realized that the message assumed the reader would understand the risk of being seen, that it was written by someone who knew fear intimately. That knowledge created a bond he had not asked for but could not deny. He looked through the trailer window toward the disturbed earth, feeling as though he were being watched by something that did not need eyes. The idea of leaving crossed his mind, but it felt like running from himself rather than from danger. Whatever was buried there had waited a long time to be found. As evening approached, the light shifted and shadows pooled around the hole, making the door hard to see but easier to imagine. Santiago stood at the edge again, the sky darkening behind him, aware that night would change how everything felt. He wondered what kind of life could be sealed underground and still speak to him across years of silence. The fear he felt was no longer sharp but dense, layered with curiosity and an unexpected sense of responsibility. He had come here to vanish, to live without history, but the land had offered him someone else's unfinished story instead. The realization settled heavily in his chest, altering the shape of his plans without his permission. He knew that once night fell, the door would not leave his thoughts. And standing there, with the wind rising and the earth open at his feet, Santiago understood that finding the house meant he was no longer alone in hiding. Santiago did not sleep that night, and when he tried, his body treated the mattress like unfamiliar ground that could not be trusted. Every sound outside the trailer arrived sharpened, stripped of its harmless explanations, as if the land were rehearsing ways to draw him back. He lay still with his eyes open, replaying the texture of the carved letters beneath his fingertips and the calm certainty with which they had been cut. The message had not sounded like a warning meant to scare someone away, but like instructions left by someone who assumed the reader would understand the cost. He wondered how many others had stood where he stood and chosen to leave without digging further. The thought unsettled him more than the idea of discovery, because it suggested a history of fear layered beneath his own. When dawn finally crept through the thin curtains, relief came mixed with disappointment. Morning made the world ordinary again, and he was not sure he wanted it to be. He returned to hole with coffee cooling in his hand, standing at its edge like someone approaching a grave without knowing the name on the stone. The daylight revealed details he had missed, including the careful way the earth had been packed, almost engineered to collapse inward rather than expose what lay beneath. Santiago recognized the work of patience, of someone who had expected erosion and curiosity and planned for both. He crouched and brushed away loose dirt, noting how the doorframe was reinforced with metal strips now rusted but intact. This was not improvised concealment, but a deliberate erasure, carried out with time and resources that contradicted the emptiness of the land above. He imagined the labor involved, the quiet hours spent burying a life one shovel at a time. The effort felt personal in a way that unsettled him deeply. Whoever did this had believed the house was worth hiding. The words on the door seemed darker in the morning, the grooves casting thin shadows that sharpened their meaning. Santiago read them again, slower this time, allowing each phrase to settle instead of rushing past it. The language carried no dates, no names, only assumptions about fear, movement, and silence that mirrored his own life too closely to be coincidence. He felt an irrational surge of anger, as if someone had reached across time and claimed him without consent. At the same time, a quieter part of him felt seen in a way he had avoided for years. The door did not ask him to open it, but its presence made refusal feel like another form of cowardice. He told himself he could walk away after the day. That understanding did not require action. The lie sat poorly in his chest. He decided to search the land records at the county office, an impulse that immediately collided with reality. Entering public buildings had become an exercise in measuring risk, in calculating how much of himself he could afford to expose. Santiago drove anyway, choosing back roads, rehearsing explanations he hoped he would not need to give. The office was small and quiet, staffed by people who looked at him briefly and then looked away, uninterested in a man asking careful questions. He asked about the parcel, about prior structures, about any mention of demolition or reclamation. The clerk found nothing beyond the trailer permit and an old transfer marked incomplete. The absence felt deliberate, like a missing tooth the tongue keeps finding. When he left, the sun fell harsher, the world less forgiving. Back at the trailer, Santiago noticed tire tracks he did not remember making, faint impressions leading toward a road and disappearing again. He crouched to examine them, aware of how quickly suspicion could become obsession, yet unable to dismiss the unease. The tracks were old, softened by wind, but they confirmed his growing sense that the land had not been as abandoned as advertised. He circled the property slowly, counting fence posts, mapping sight lines, imagining where someone could watch without being seen. The exercise reminded him of nights spent hiding in ditches, learning the shapes of danger by heart. He realized then how easily his past skills had returned, how ready he was to believe he was being hunted. The thought exhausted him, but it also clarified something he had been avoiding. The door had changed how he saw this place, and there was no reversing that. As afternoon stretched on, Santiago gathered tools he pretended were for repairs, though he knew what he intended to do. He reinforced the edges of the hole, shoring up the dirt so it would not collapse further, working with care that bordered on reverence. The physical labor grounded him, each measured movement away to quiet his thoughts without silencing them completely. He uncovered more of the door, revealing a heavy iron handle darkened by age but still solid. The craftsmanship suggested pride, a refusal to accept disposability even in concealment. Santiago paused with his hand hovering inches away, aware of how final the gesture might feel. He thought of his mother's house, long sold, its address now meaningless to him. The idea of another home erased beneath the earth felt like an insult he could not ignore. He did not open the door, but he leaned close enough to smell the wood, damp and faintly sweet with decay. The scent triggered memories of shelters and basements, of places meant to protect but never truly safe. He wondered who had lived here and what had forced him to choose burial over abandonment. The question gnawed at him, growing heavier with each moment he remained unanswered. Santiago realized he was afraid not of what he might find inside, but of what it might confirm about his own life. If someone like him had once needed to disappear this completely, then hiding was not a solution, only a delay. The door became a mirror, reflecting possibilities he had tried to outrun. He stepped back, unsettled by how personal the fear had become. That evening, a truck passed slowly on the road, its engine cutting through the quiet with deliberate restraint. Santiago froze, watching from the trailer window as the vehicle continued without stopping, its presence lingering longer than its sound. He told himself it was coincidence, but the reassurance rang hollow. The land felt newly claimed, as if revealing the house had shifted an invisible balance. He considered covering the hole for night, then rejected the idea, unwilling to pretend ignorance again. Instead, he sat with the lights off, listening, counting breaths, measuring the distance between himself and the door. The silence pressed in, no longer empty but expectant. He understood that whatever choice he made next would follow him far beyond this place. When darkness settled fully, Santiago stepped outside, the sky wide and indifferent above him. He stood at the edge of the hole, the door now a darker shape within deeper shadow, and felt the weight of the words carve into it more than their meaning. The land offered no guidance, no warning, only the quiet persistence of what had been hidden. He realized that the house had not been buried to keep people out, but to keep something in, something that had outlived its owners. The thought tightened his throat, filling him with a mix of dread and obligation he could not name. He had come here to erase himself, but the land had remembered someone else instead. Standing there, Santiago understood that some disappearances leave scars beneath the surface, and he knew he would not be able to walk away without knowing why. Santiago waited until the land surrendered to night before touching the handle, as if darkness were a kind of permission he could borrow. The metal was colder than he expected, pulling heat from his skin and replacing it with a steady, deliberate chill. He hesitated, listening for sounds that might warn him away, but the quiet remained unbroken and unhelpful. When he finally pulled, the door resisted with a weight that spoke of age rather than neglect. The hinges groaned softly, a restrained sound that felt practiced, as though the door had learned long ago not to draw attention. A narrow opening appeared, exhaling air that smelled of damp earth and something older, something held too long without light. Santiago stepped back, startled by how intimate the exchange felt. He fetched a flashlight from the trailer, the beam cutting a thin, artificial path into the darkness below. The space beyond the door sloped downward, revealing stairs carved from stone and reinforced with wood that had been treated and maintained. Each step bore shallow grooves, worn by repeated use rather than erosion, and the sight tightened his chest unexpectedly. This had not been a place of panic or haste, but a routine of people coming and going with purpose. Santiago descended slowly, counting steps without knowing why, his breath loud in his ears despite his efforts to quiet it. The walls closed in around him, not claustrophobic but deliberate, guiding movement rather than restricting it. He realized he was more afraid of recognition than danger. The staircase felt like a memory he had never lived but somehow understood. At the bottom, the stairs opened into a small entryway lit only by his flashlight, revealing furniture arranged with care rather than abandonment. A table stood against one wall, its surface clear except for a thin layer of dust and a folded cloth placed with intention. Shelves lined another wall, holding jars now empty but labeled in careful handwriting that had faded with time. Santiago's pulse slowed as he took in the orderliness of the space, the absence of chaos he had expected. This was not a bunker or a hiding hole, but a home shaped by restraint and patience. The realization unsettled him more than disarray would have, because it suggested long-term living rather than temporary refuge. He imagined meals eaten quietly, conversations held in low voices, routines built around caution. The house felt paused rather than abandoned. He moved deeper, discovering a narrow hallway that branched into rooms marked by subtle differences in construction. One room held a bed with blankets folded neatly at its foot, the fabric brittle but intact, as if waiting for someone who had promised to return. Another contained a desk and chair positioned toward a blank wall, the surface scarred by years of writing or counting. Santiago ran his fingers along the desk edge, feeling shallow notches that hinted at habit, perhaps a nervous gesture repeated during long waits. The intimacy of these traces made him uncomfortable, like reading a stranger's diary without permission. He wondered how long the house had remained sealed, and how no one had noticed the void it left behind. The absence of decay suggested care even after burial, a contradiction he could not resolve. He felt as though he were trespassing on a decision rather than a place. In what appeared to be a common room, Santiago found a radio mounted on the wall, its face cracked but its dials still labeled. The antenna had been extended and fixed into the stone above, an act that spoke of stubborn hope rather than practicality. He imagined voices filtered through static, news arriving distorted but vital, proof of a world continuing above ground. The thought stirred an old ache in him, the memory of listening for languages he barely understood just to feel less alone. Nearby, a calendar hung open to a single month, the pages before and after removed with care. The dates circled in pencil meant nothing to him, yet it radiated importance through its isolation. Santiago felt the weight of time pressing unevenly, as if the house refused to acknowledge anything beyond that mark. He noticed then how quiet the space truly was, a silence thickened by earth and intention rather than emptiness. His footsteps sounded intrusive, a disruption rather than exploration, and he found himself moving more slowly out of respect he had not consciously chosen. In a small kitchen area, he discovered a cupboard stocked with utensils arranged by size, their metal dull but clean. The attention to detail felt like a conversation across years, a reassurance that order had once existed even here. Santiago thought of the chaos he had fled, the randomness of danger that made planning feel futile. This house contradicted that philosophy entirely, insisting that preparation mattered even when survival was uncertain. The idea unsettled him, challenging the way he had learned to endure. He felt both comforted and accused by the space. In a corner room, partially hidden by a door left ajar, Santiago found a trunk secured with a simple latch. He hesitated before opening it, aware that crossing this threshold would feel different, more personal. Inside, he discovered documents wrapped in oilcloth, photographs pressed flat between pages, and a small stack of notebooks bound with string. The faces in the photographs stared back at him with expressions caught between caution and resolve. People who looked neither desperate nor safe. Santiago recognized something familiar in their eyes, a quiet calculation that never fully rests. The notebooks were written in Spanish, the handwriting precise and disciplined, the margins filled with dates and names that meant nothing to him yet. He closed the trunk gently, shaken by the sense of inheritance he could not refuse. As he stood there, the weight of the house pressing in from all sides, Santiago felt a shift he could not articulate without fear. This was not merely a hidden dwelling, but a record of lives lived in parallel to his own, shaped by the same forces of exclusion and necessity. The care taken to bury it suggested protection rather than shame, an attempt to preserve something fragile in a hostile world. He wondered whether the people who lived here had succeeded in what he had not, in building continuity instead of escape. The thought stirred a longing he had tried to starve, the desire to belong somewhere without being visible. He realized then that the house was not a coincidence, but a message extended through time. The words on the door had not been a warning, but an invitation to remember. Santiago climbed back toward the surface as night deepened, carrying the weight of what had seemed like an unspoken vow. The land above felt different now, thinner somehow, as though the secret beneath it had altered its substance. He stood by the open door, looking down at the space he had entered, and wondering whether leaving it uncovered was an act of trust or defiance. The house had given him more questions than answers. An imbalance felt deliberate rather than accidental. He sensed that the story contained there was unfinished, waiting not for discovery, but for continuation. As he covered the opening enough to hide it from casual view, he felt the burden of choice settle fully into his chest. The realization that he had been chosen, not by chance but by circumstance, left him unsettled and alert. And for the first time since arriving, Santiago questioned whether disappearing had ever been the right goal. Santiago spent the next day moving through the hours as if they belonged to someone else, performing small tasks around the trailer with precision that felt borrowed. He repaired a loose hinge, cleaned dust from surfaces that would be dusty again by night, and cooked food he barely touched. Each action served as a way to avoid thinking about the notebooks resting in the trunk below the earth. The house had followed him upward, settling into his thoughts with the weight of something unfinished. He caught himself listening for sounds beneath his feet, irrationally expecting movement where he knew there was none. The land remained quiet, indifferent to his vigilance, yet the silence no longer felt empty. It felt observant, as though it were measuring him in return. By late afternoon, curiosity overcame restraint, and Santiago returned to the hole with the careful resolve of someone approaching confession. He descended again, slower this time, allow his eyes to adjust without relying immediately on the flashlight. The house revealed itself differently in the dimness, shadows softening edges and making the space feel less like a discovery and more like a return. He went straight to the trunk, kneeling beside it with a familiarity that surprised him. Opening it felt inevitable rather than deliberate, as if the decision had been made long before he arrived. He lifted the notebooks out one by one, their covers stiff but unbroken, the string binding them intact. The weight of them in his hands carried an authority he could not explain away. He chose the first notebook and opened it carefully, the pages whispering as they separated. The writing inside was dense and orderly, paragraphs formed without embellishment, each line pressed into the paper with controlled pressure. Santiago recognized the tone immediately, the voice of someone who did not trust memory alone. The entry spoke of work done quietly, of routes taken and avoided, of nights measured by sound rather than time. There were references to names he did not know and places described without detail, as if specificity itself were dangerous. The writer assumed a reader who understood omission, who knew that survival often depended on what was left unsaid. Santiago felt an unexpected tightening in his chest, a recognition that bordered on grief. As he read, he realized the notebooks were not diaries but records meant to preserve patterns rather than feelings. Yet emotion bled through in the spaces between words, in the careful repetition of certain phrases, and the sudden absence of others. One entry mentioned a child only once, without elaboration, and never returned to the subject. Another described a night of waiting that stretched into morning, the language tightening as if the writer were holding their breath even on the page. Santiago paused often, not because he did not understand, but because understanding felt invasive. These were not stories meant for comfort or explanation, but for continuity, a way to ensure that knowledge survived even if people did not. He wondered who had been expected to read them and when. In the second notebook, Santiago found sketches of the land above, drawn with spare lines that captured elevation and distance rather than beauty. The trailer lot was there too, marked long before the trailer itself existed, its emptiness noted with a brief annotation. He traced the lines with his finger, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the underground air. This place had been chosen, not stumbled upon, its isolation valued rather than tolerated. The realization reframed his purchase as something uncomfortably close to inheritance. He thought of the seller's eagerness again, the way the transaction had felt rushed and incomplete. It occurred to him that the land might have been waiting for someone like him, someone who would not ask questions too soon. The thought left him uneasy, caught between suspicion and reluctant gratitude. The third notebook shifted in tone, its entries shorter, more fragmented, though still disciplined. There were references to listening posts, to signals missed and messages delayed, to a growing sense of narrowing options. Santiago felt the tension increase with each page, the controlled voice straining against circumstances it could no longer shape. One entry ended mid-sentence, The ink pressed hard enough to tear the paper slightly. The next page was blank and the remaining pages untouched. He closed the notebook slowly, aware that he was holding the edge of something unresolved. The absence of an ending felt heavier than any description could have been. He wondered whether the writer had run out of time, or faith, or simply ink. Santiago sat back on his heels, the notebook stacked beside him like witnesses. The house seemed smaller now, not because it had changed, but because its purpose had sharpened into focus. This was not merely a refuge, but a node in a network of quiet survival, a place designed to exist without acknowledgement. He imagined others like him passing through, learning what they needed, leaving little trace behind. The idea both comforted and disturbed him, suggesting a lineage he had never known he belonged to. He felt a pull toward responsibility he had not chosen, an obligation that felt heavier than fear. The house had outlived its builders, and now it waited again. Santiago wondered whether survival always carried such debts. He returned the notebooks to the trunk with care, resisting the urge to take them above ground. Removing them felt like theft rather than study, a violation of the balance the house maintained. Instead, he closed the trunk and sat quietly, listening to the faint hum of the earth pressing in around him. The space felt patient, neither urging him forward nor pushing him away. He realized then that the house did not demand action, but offered context, a way to understand his own life as part of something larger and older. The realization unsettled him more than danger ever had. He had survived by remaining unconnected, and this place challenged that strategy at its core. He felt exposed in a way he could not explain to anyone else. When he finally climbed back to the surface, the sky was heavy with clouds, the air thick with the promise of rain. Santiago stood there longer than necessary, breathing in the scent of wet earth and distance. The land looked unchanged, yet he knew it held layers invisible to anyone passing by. He considered the possibility that someone might come looking for the house, drawn by the same knowledge that had led him here. The thought did not feel paranoid so much as inevitable. He covered the opening again, more carefully than before, restoring the illusion of emptiness with practiced hands. As he finished, a question settled into him with quiet insistence. If the house had been built to be found by someone like him, what was he expected to do next? The rain arrived that night without ceremony, a steady fall that softened the land and blurred the edges of everything Santiago could see from the trailer window. He watched it for a long time, the water darkening the soil above the buried house, erasing his footprints with an efficiency that felt intentional. The sound of it was not comforting, but it was familiar. Echoing nights he had spent waiting under tarps and trees, measuring safety by rhythm rather than shelter. He slept in short, uneasy stretches, waking each time the wind shifted or the trailer creaked under the weight of water. In those moments between sleep and waking, he imagined the house below filling slowly, the walls pressing inward, the silence growing heavier. He knew it was not happening, yet the image persisted, an anxious metaphor he could not shake. By morning, exhaustion sat behind his eyes like a bruise. When the rain finally eased, Santiago stepped outside and found the land subtly altered, its surface smoother, its contours less certain. The area behind the trailer looked almost untouched again, the careful burial holding despite the weather. He felt an irrational surge of relief, followed quickly by guilt for caring so deeply about something that was not his. The house had begun to reorder his priorities without asking permission, drawing emotional weight away from the life he had tried to build in isolation. He forced himself to focus on practical matters, checking the trailer's undercarriage, ensuring nothing had shifted. Each inspection felt like an excuse to remain near the buried space. He realized he was lingering, waiting for something to happen, though he could not name what. The land offered no answers, only quiet endurance. Later that day, a knock on the trailer door startled him so badly he dropped the cup he was holding. The sound was firm but not aggressive, a measured assertion rather than a demand. Santiago stood frozen, his pulse roaring his ears, every instinct urging him towards silence. The knock came again, followed by a voice calling out, calm and unhurried. It was a man's voice, unfamiliar, carrying the casual authority of someone who expected to be acknowledged. Santiago weighed his options quickly, aware that refusal might draw more attention than compliance. He opened the door just enough to see a man in his late 40s, dressed plainly, his posture relaxed but watchful. The stranger introduced himself as Daniel, a neighbor from several miles down the road. Daniel spoke easily, commenting on the weather, on how rarely anyone bought land out here anymore. His eyes moved constantly, not in a searching way, but as if he were cataloging the space by habit. Santiago answered with care, offering little beyond polite acknowledgement. His mind racing to fill the silence Daniel left deliberately open. The man mentioned the cellar, noting how quickly he had left town. How surprising that had been. The comment landed too precisely to feel accidental, and Santiago felt his chest tighten. Daniel smiled slightly, as if aware of the effect his words had. He asked how Santiago was settling in, whether the land was treating him well. The question felt layered, its simplicity disguising something heavier beneath. Santiago chose his words carefully, describing the trailer, the quiet, the appeal of isolation. Daniel nodded, his expression unreadable, then glanced toward the back of the property. The look lasted only a second, but it was enough to send a chill through Santiago's spine. Daniel asked if the ground had held up during the rain, mentioning sinkholes that sometimes appeared in older lots. Santiago felt the weight of the lie forming even before he spoke, the effort required to make it sound natural. He said everything seemed fine, that he had noticed nothing unusual. The lie settled between them, dense and fragile, changing the shape of the conversation immediately. Daniel accepted the answer with a nod that suggested he had expected it. They talked a few minutes longer, about nothing that mattered, until Daniel finally stepped back. His visit concluded without explanation. As he walked away, he turned once more, his gaze resting briefly on Santiago with an intensity that lingered after he was gone. Santiago closed the door and leaned against it, his legs weak with the delayed impact of fear. The encounter had confirmed what he'd been trying to ignore, that the land was not as forgotten as it pretended to be. Someone knew about the instability, about the buried past, even if they did not name it openly. The realization reframed the house as something watched rather than lost. Santiago felt exposed, as though he had stepped into a role he did not understand. That night, he returned to the house with a sense of urgency that bordered on panic. He moved quickly, checking the walls, the rooms, the trunk, searching for signs of disturbance. Everything was exactly as he had left it, the stillness unbroken and indifferent to his fear. Yet the presence of Daniel's questions echoed in his mind, turning each shadow into potential evidence of surveillance. Santiago realized that his isolation had been an illusion maintained by distance rather than secrecy. The house had never truly disappeared. It had merely been ignored until someone like him arrived. He wondered how many others had been tested by similar visits. So inquiries designed to measure compliance. The thought made his skin crawl. He sat at the small table in the entryway, his head in his hands, breathing slowly until the tightness in his chest eased. The house felt unchanged, but his relationship to it had shifted irrevocably. This was no longer a passive discovery, but an active risk, a choice he would have to keep making. He understood then that the notebooks were not only records but instructions, a guide to navigating attention without attracting it. The realization carried a strange comfort, the sense of being less alone in his caution. Someone had anticipated this moment, had planned for curiosity and intrusion alike. Santiago felt the weight of that foresight settle over him like a mantle. As he climbed back to the surface before dawn, Santiago knew he could no longer pretend neutrality. The house demanded discretion, and the land demanded silence, but the world beyond them was beginning to notice. Daniel's visit had been a warning disguised as neighborliness, a reminder that secrecy required participation. Santiago looked out over the empty road, the sky lightening at the edges, and felt the shape of his future narrowing. He had come here to disappear, but disappearing, he realized, required more than isolation. It required choices he had hoped never to make. And standing there, with a buried house beneath him and watchful eyes somewhere beyond the hills, Santiago understood that the next move would not be optional. Santiago began to notice patterns in the days that followed, subtle repetitions that only revealed themselves to someone accustomed to watching from the margins. A car passed on the road every morning at nearly the same time, never stopping, never slowing enough to seem curious, yet present with an insistence that felt measured. He stopped working outside during those hours, retreating into the trailer with a stillness that felt practiced and old. The quiet he had once sought now demanded effort to maintain, an active discipline rather than a natural state. He found himself timing his movements, learning when the land felt truly empty and when it merely pretended to be. The realization unsettled him, because it suggested an audience that did not need proximity to observe. Disappearing, he understood now, was not the same as being unseen. He returned to the notebooks with renewed attention, reading them not as historical artifacts, but as manuals shaped by experience. Certain entries took on new meaning in light of Daniel's visit, phrases about patience and misdirection standing out where they had once seemed abstract. Santiago recognized the careful avoidance of detail as a strategy rather than fear, a way of leaving room for interpretation without committing to truth. He noticed how the writer described encounters obliquely, never naming individuals, focusing instead on tone and timing. The restraint felt deliberate, a refusal to give future readers more than they needed to survive. Santiago felt a quiet respect for that discipline, understanding how easily excess honesty could become a liability. The notebooks no longer felt distant. They felt instructional. One afternoon, while reinforcing the trailer's skirting, Santiago found a shallow marker embedded in the soil, nearly invisible unless you knew how to look. It was a simple metal tag, unmarked, placed with the same care he had seen throughout the house below. He did not remove it, instinctively understanding that its value lay in remaining unnoticed. The discovery confirmed what he had begun to suspect, that the land functioned as a boundary rather than a destination. It marked a space meant to be respected, not occupied, its purpose defined by restraint. Santiago felt a strange sense of relief at the clarity, even as the implications deepened his unease. This place had rules, and he was only beginning to learn them. The land was not empty. It was regulated by silence. Daniel returned a week later, this time without knocking, calling out from a respectful distance, as if announcing himself to someone he expected to be wary. Santiago stepped outside slowly, controlling his breathing, his expression carefully neutral. Daniel spoke again about weather and roads, about how easily people underestimate isolation. He mentioned rumors of old structures, of things that sometimes surfaced after heavy rain, his tone casual but precise. Santiago listened without responding, letting the silence stretch until it forced Daniel to continue. The tactic felt risky but necessary, a small assertion of control. Daniel eventually smiled, a thin expression that did not reach his eyes, and said that it was good to see Santiago settling in. The statement felt less like reassurance and more like a conclusion. After Daniel left, Santiago felt the weight of decision pressing harder than before. The house below no longer felt like a secret he could simply keep. It was becoming a point of negotiation between himself and forces he did not fully understand. He realized that his presence here was being evaluated, his behavior measured against expectations he had not agreed to. The thought stirred a familiar anger, the resentment of being judged without context or consent. Yet alongside it was a grudging understanding that survival often required compliance before resistance. Santiago weighed the cost of leaving against the cost of staying, aware that either choice carried consequences. The house had bound him to land in ways he had not anticipated. He began to prepare quietly, not for escape, but for continuity, mirroring the careful habits documented in the notebooks. He mapped sightlines from the trailer, noted changes in traffic, adjusted his routines to appear predictably unremarkable. The discipline felt both exhausting and strangely grounding, a return to skills honed under different pressures. Santiago understood now that anonymity was not passive but performed, a role requiring constant attention. The house below felt less like a burden and more like a partner in that performance, its presence anchoring his vigilance. He no longer felt alone in his caution, though the companionship was abstract and silent. The land seemed to accept his efforts without comment. One evening, while reading by lantern light in the buried house, Santiago noticed a loose stone in the wall behind the desk. He pressed it gently, and a small compartment opened, revealing a single envelope sealed with wax long since cracked. Inside was a letter written in the same precise hand as the notebooks, addressed not to a name but to a description, a reader who had arrived quietly and stayed. The letter spoke of choice and consequence, of the inevitability of being found if one remained long enough. It did not offer advice so much as acknowledgment, recognizing the burden of inheriting unfinished work. Santiago felt a tightening in his throat as he read, the words resonating with an intimacy that felt earned rather than intrusive. The letter ended without instruction, only with gratitude. He folded the letter carefully and returned it to its place, aware that the act marked a shift he could not undo. The house had acknowledged him not as an intruder, but as a successor, someone expected to decide what came next. Santiago felt the weight of that expectation settle fully, altering his understanding of why he had been drawn here in the first place. He realized that disappearing had never been the goal of the people who built this place. Survival had been, even if it required visibility at the right moments. The distinction reframed his own choices, challenging the simplicity of his plans. Standing there, surrounded by evidence of deliberate endurance, Santiago understood that hiding was only the beginning of a longer story, and he knew that whatever he chose next would determine whether the house remained buried or finally spoke again. The letter followed Santiago back to the surface like a second shadow, its words repeating in his mind long after he had sealed the compartment again. He moved through the day with a heightened awareness, every sound and pause carrying potential meaning. The land felt tighter now, its openness revealed as a carefully maintained illusion rather than a guarantee of freedom. Santiago recognized the sensation from earlier chapters of his life, the moment when hiding transformed into stewardship. He had not chosen this role, but the refusal to choose felt like a decision of its own. The house had survived because someone had stayed when leaving would have been easier. That knowledge pressed on him with quiet insistence. He began to notice small signs of attention that might once have escaped him entirely. A fence post repaired where he did not remember damage. A gate left open and then closed again without explanation, a shift in how often the road carried sound. None of it was overt enough to justify a confrontation, yet together it formed a pattern that felt deliberate. Santiago resisted the urge to respond directly, understanding instinctively that acknowledgement could invite escalation. Instead, he focused on making himself unremarkable, visible only in ways that suggested harmless routine. He worked at predictable hours, waved at passing vehicles, allowed himself to be seen in controlled glimpses. The performance felt exhausting but necessary, a balance between presence and erasure. At night, the house offered a different kind of clarity, its underground stillness insulating him from the watchfulness above. Santiago returned to the notebooks again, reading passages he had skipped before, finding meaning in repetition rather than revelation. He realized that the writers had faced similar scrutiny, adapting not by confrontation but by patience. Their lives had unfolded in the margins, sustained by restraint and mutual understanding rather than force. Santiago felt a growing respect for the discipline required to live that way, to accept limitation without surrendering purpose. The house no longer felt like a relic, but like a conversation extended across time. He wondered whether the people who built it had ever imagined someone like him would answer. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the land in muted gold, Daniel's truck appeared again, stopping this time at the edge of property. Daniel did not get out immediately, remaining inside as if allowing Santiago time to decide how the encounter would unfold. Santiago stepped forward slowly, meeting him halfway, the distance between them measured and intentional. They spoke without preamble, Daniel asking whether Santiago planned to stay long, his tone neutral, but waited. Santiago answered honestly without offering detail, saying only that he had found what he needed for now. The words felt truer than he expected, carrying an implication he did not fully understand until he heard them aloud. Daniel studied him for a long moment, then nodded as if confirming something internally. Daniel spoke then of responsibility, of places that survived because people understood when to protect them and when to let them go. He did not mention the house, but the omission felt more significant than any direct reference could have been. Santiago listened without interruption, recognizing the careful boundaries of the conversation. There was no threat, only an assessment, an unspoken acknowledgement of shared awareness. When Daniel finally left, the absence felt different, less ominous, as though a tentative agreement had been reached without terms being spoken. Santiago realized that visibility, when managed, could serve as a shield rather than a liability. The encounter left him shaken but resolute. In the days that followed, Santiago made a choice that surprised him with its simplicity. He did not cover the house completely again, leaving just enough access to ensure it could be reached if needed. The act felt symbolic, a quiet commitment rather than a declaration. He began maintaining the space below more deliberately, clearing moisture, reinforcing weak points, preserving what time had spared. The work gave his days a sense of continuity he had not felt in years, a rhythm rooted in care rather than avoidance. He understood now that survival did not always mean escape. Sometimes it meant preservation. The house became less a secret and more of a responsibility he carried willingly. He thought often of the people whose lives had shaped this place, whose decisions had created conditions for his arrival. Their absence felt present rather than empty, a reminder that stories did not end simply because witnesses disappeared. Santiago began to see his own life differently, not as a series of evasions, but as part of a longer movement shaped by necessity. The fear that had once driven him softened into vigilance, a more sustainable state. He felt the quiet satisfaction of competence, of knowing when to act and when to remain still. The land seemed to respond, its silence less oppressive and more companionable. He felt, for the first time, a cautious sense of belonging. As autumn approached, Santiago understood that the choice he had made would eventually demand articulation. The house could not remain buried forever, not if it was to fulfill its purpose. He sensed that telling its story would be as risky as keeping it hidden, yet equally necessary. The notebooks and letter had been preserved not for secrecy alone, but for transmission, for the moment when silence would become its own form of danger. Santiago felt the weight of that realization settle fully, clarify what the future would require of him. He had inherited more than land and shelter. He had inherited a narrative waiting to be carried forward. Standing at the edge of property one evening, he accepted that survival sometimes meant becoming a witness, and he knew the next step would change not only his life, but the fate of what lay buried beneath his feet. Santiago waited until winter thinned the land of movement before acting, understanding instinctively that timing mattered as much as intent. The cold simplified the world, reducing traffic and curiosity, allowing patterns to settle into predictability. He spent long hours in the buried house, organizing the notebooks, aligning dates, reconstructing a chronology that had been deliberately fractured. What emerged was not a tale of crime or conspiracy, but of quiet logistics of families and individuals who had used the house as a waypoint during decades when crossing openly meant disappearance. The house had never been meant to last forever, only long enough to outlive a specific danger. Its burial had been an act of protection, preserving knowledge until conditions shifted. Santiago felt the gravity of that patience settle into him, reshaping his understanding of endurance. The central mystery clarified not in a single revelation, but through accumulation, through the slow agreement of evidence. The people who built the house had been undocumented like him, but they had also been organizers, caretakers of movement rather than fugitives from it. They had mapped safe pauses and journeys that could not be recorded officially, creating infrastructure where none was permitted to exist. The land had been purchased under names that no longer existed, transferred and abandoned until it became invisible by neglect. Daniel, Santiago realized, was not a guardian of secrets, but a monitor of transitions, ensuring the buried things remained undisturbed until the right kind of attention arrived. The house had been hidden not from authorities, but from time itself. Santiago understood then that his arrival had not been coincidence, but convergence. The words carved into the door took on their full meaning only now, no longer a warning but a recognition. They had been written for someone who would understand the weight of arrival, someone whose life had been shaped by silence and movement. The message assumed the reader would know when hiding had served its purpose and when it had become a liability. Santiago felt a deep, quiet grief for the lives that had passed through this place without acknowledgement, their stories reduced to necessity rather than memory. He understood that the house had survived because someone had chosen to bury it instead of destroying it. Preservation had been an act of faith rather than fear. That faith now rested with him. Santiago made contact cautiously, not with authorities, but with historians and legal advocates who understood the difference between exposure and testimony. He shared the story incrementally, contextualizing the house as a historical artifact rather than a current operation. The narrative shifted from secrecy to significance, framed by the distance of time and the protection of anonymity. The land records were amended quietly, acknowledging the structure without reviving the dangers that had required its concealment. The house remained underground, but no longer erased. Its existence became part of a broader story of movement, resilience, and unrecorded labor. Santiago felt the tension ease as the truth found a shape that did not endanger the living. Daniel's role resolved itself naturally, his watchfulness giving way to a measured relief. When they spoke again, there was no pretense left between them, only acknowledgement of a task completed at the right moment. Daniel admitted that he had been waiting for someone who would recognize the house not as opportunity or threat, but as responsibility. Santiago understood then that stewardship did not always involve ownership, only care and timing. The land did not need him forever, only long enough for the story to surface safely. The exchange closed a chapter, without ceremony, the way necessary things often do. The watchfulness receded, replaced by distance and ordinary quiet. Santiago chose not to leave immediately, allowing the land to return to stillness around him. He continued living in the trailer, his presence now unremarkable in a different way, shaped by transparency rather than concealment. The house below remained sealed, its purpose fulfilled, its silence now earned rather than enforced. Santiago felt a subtle but profound shift in his own life, the constant pressure of invisibility easing into something more sustainable. He had not gained papers or permanence, but he had gained context. His life no longer felt like an interruption, but like a continuation. The difference settled into him with surprising calm. The emotional residue of the experience lingered in quiet moments, in the awareness that some history survived only because someone chose not to look away. Santiago understood that he had been trusted not because he was exceptional, but because he was familiar with erasure. That familiarity had allowed him to recognize value where others might have seen inconvenience or risk. He carried the stories forward not as a hero or savior, but as a witness who arrived at the right time. The house had not needed rescue, only recognition. Its survival had depended on restraint, and so had his. The parallel felt complete. Standing one evening as the sun dipped behind the hills, Santiago reflected on how close he had come to leaving without digging deeper. The shovel striking the wall had been an accident, but everything after had been choice. He understood now that disappearance was never an end state, only a pause between tellings. Some stories endured not because they were loud, but because they waited patiently for someone willing to listen. Santiago had been that person, not by design, but by disposition. The land felt lighter for it, and so did he. The silence that remained was no longer empty, but resolved. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to the channel for more stories about hidden lives, buried histories, and the people who choose to carry them forward.